Hello. I'm here alone today. It's just y'all and me. So this is kind of old school. Back in 2017, 2018, when I started doing this live show every Thursday, this is what it was all about. It was all about Q&A with you in chat and basically live streaming for hours, answering questions, digging in, getting into VS Code, going through some GitHub, and that's what we're going to do today. So congratulations for being here. Good job. You get free tech support. That's what this free tech support show is about. I mean, it's just really Q&A and whatever rabbit holes we want to go down, let's do that. Nirmal is actually flying back from the Docker Captain Summit, and that was in Portugal this week. I was unfortunately sick. I was sick, and I couldn't go. So I had to cancel my flight last minute, and I've been on cough syrup and cough drops ever since. So that might happen during this show. We might have to cut it short if my voice goes early, which I've got my special, DevOps tea, which means throat coat, so I can last a little bit longer with my voice than normal. And Normal will be back. In fact, next week, if you didn't know, we do kind of these Q&As once a month at least, sometimes every other week. Next week, we're going to be talking all about machine learning ops, or ML ops. We're going to have a guest on the show. Normal's going to be back, and my doggy's in the room, and my little puppy's taking a nap. Oh, there he goes. Sometimes he gets on camera, sometimes he doesn't hang out, so he doesn't get to be here. So Anton's got the first thing up about Argo CD. So let's get into some Argo CD. We've got some other people in the audience. Let's see. Nader's here. Srinath. Jerome, what's up? Florentina. Caesar. Rashik, what's up, everybody? Sorry if I'm mispronouncing a few of the names there, but I'm always looking for help with pronunciations. Tea and honey with a lemon wedge works magic for my throat. Yes, I actually have slippery elm, which honey does help me, but the thing that really, really works for me, and I've tried. There's sprays and things that like singers use. My brother's a singer. And so I get a lot of tips, but the thing that's really worked for me is slippery elm. I can take like a 45 to 1 hour long call before I lose my throat, and I can go 3 or 4 hours with slippery elm. You can get it in tea form at the grocery store. You can get it in pill, or not pill, but it's like a little chewable. You can just suck on them, and I keep those handy everywhere. But with my cough this week, that's going to be a little extra challenge. So we'll see. I'm ready to go. I got coffee. I've got water. I've got tea. I've got cough drops. I am locked and loaded. So specifically Argo CD, like the Argo CD, I have a whole course on it. In case you didn't know, because it's quite its own thing. It turns out deployments are hard, and on Kubernetes they're even harder, just because we have so many concerns, and quite frankly, Kubernetes doesn't specifically make deployments harder, but it makes them way more capable. So we're able to do way more stuff than maybe in previous worlds, where you either had to create your own fancy shell scripts that would maybe do things like retry things or automatically update things or check to see if things are okay. Like that would be very advanced scripting. Or you had to rely on the cloud's service. Whatever cloud service you might be deploying with, you would have to rely on that thing to monitor and do stuff for you. Back in the day, even advanced scenarios, just 10 years ago, advanced setups, you would have a monitoring solution that would check for availability. And if availability went down, it would notify basically your scripting or automation system to then jump into your servers and try to heal things and help things. But with Argo CD, we get a ton of that out of the box, as well as monitoring for updates, whether that's in GitHub or in your images, where your images are stored. Usually I prefer the GitHub approach. That's known as GitOps. GitOps is very specific. So if you have questions about what GitOps is and isn't, we could totally get into that as well. But I have a course, and if you're interested in that course at all, we haven't done a live cohort of this since last year, but in case you didn't know, we're gonna go through my courses in a minute. Let me just do some quick announcements. I kind of jumped ahead of myself because I'm excited to get into the topics. Thank you all for being here. Rago's here and has some SSL questions. I'll see all these questions, which are all great. Frederick saying, I'm not sure K8s and WordPress is the best thing to do. It isn't if you just need to run one WordPress. Like WordPress is pretty well designed to if it's anything like I remember it, it's been a while since I've run it outside of a container, but it's not horrible to run on a server yourself. But the reality is WordPress is so popular, you can just go to different cloud services and boutique cloud companies and just let them run your WordPress. I much more prefer that than running it myself. If I was going to run my own single WordPress site, I would do that just in a Docker container. I don't need Kubernetes for that. If I'm looking for more of a business solution where I have failover servers and failover hosting containers where WordPress is running in multiple places, maybe I'm load balancing, well, that's a much more advanced setup. And I would then use Kubernetes, maybe Swarm, but likely Kubernetes for that. And so I wouldn't say in that scenario, Kubernetes and WordPress aren't good together. WordPress is just like any other web app. I use Ghost as my website hosting of choice, ghost.org, another nonprofit free open source tool. And I've been using that for a decade. I left WordPress a long time ago for Ghost. And Ghost is the same way. It's just instead of PHP, it's Node.js as the backend framework. And it runs great. So WordPress is awesome. It's actually, WordPress is used in my course for testing. You can sort of do that, and you do Drupal in my courses and stuff like that just to get an idea of all the different ways you can run this. But yeah, why not? Why not run WordPress? Kubernetes has the same rules as anything. If you're just going to run a few things, Kubernetes is like your own personal cloud. So Kubernetes is maybe a little more than you need. So why add all that complexity unless you're just learning or playing around? If it's a personal project, if it's your own website and you just want to have fun and learn stuff and you want to have experience with Kubernetes, then by all means do that. Set up a DigitalOcean VM, super simple. Install Kubernetes, or you can run DigitalOcean or AWS or Google or Azure Kubernetes that they provide, which I definitely recommend going that route, unless, again, you're trying to learn and get experience running it yourself, and then do it the hard way, run it manually. But let's get to some announcements. So just make sure that we don't skip any of the important stuff. First off, before we talk about those courses, this is a podcast. And like last week, we announced that the live stream turns into a podcast, not the Q&As yet, although we're definitely working on turning these Q&As into some more valuable content, split up and edited down. But when I have guests on the show, and we've got lots of guests on the show, we've had hundreds of guests on this show, that turns into an audio-only podcast. And now, as of last week, thanks to my team and Christy for editing it down, this channel now hosts technically 2 podcasts. In case you didn't know, YouTube is now like the home of podcasts, which why not? Spotify is also a great place. But if you want the video version in the podcast tab of this website, check out later on this channel. Normally, we've always had this goes into this giant playlist of hundreds of episodes. Well, that's the wrong one. Giant episodes list of all the shows, right? So we're live here. I don't know why that one should be at the top. But yeah, you can just go back in time. Tons of stuff, right? So we've now marked this one as the live show. So this is the live podcast. And then when it's edited, you can now choose audio on a traditional podcast player like Spotify, Apple Podcast, whatever you want. Or you can now come here and see, starting with a recent episode on K2D, a pretty slick project that I'm excited to get your feedback on because I haven't used it in a real capacity yet, but others have been interested in it. So I'm interested in seeing people. But we had the Portainer team on to talk about K2D. So this is the edited version with a brief intro and then a much shorter show that takes out all my ums and stutters and all the stuff that we don't really need, right? So we're going to start doing that. And hopefully people like that. Hopefully people like the edited down version instead of the longer live stream version with all these intros and stuff like this. So you can check that out. Let me know. We could technically probably do video podcasts in Spotify, but we're not planning on that. We're planning on just having it here on YouTube, the home of all my content. If you're not on the newsletter and you're interested in any of my content, you absolutely should be on the newsletter. Just go to bret.news, BRET.news, and you get on this newsletter that we send out once a week, once every other week. It's not very often, but it's just what I'm creating and releasing. So it's not a bunch of industry news. It's not a bunch of stuff outside, usually. I mean, there might be a few things in there, but that's not normally what this is about. This is about who's going to be on the show, who's going to be on the podcast, what I'm learning and what I'm creating, what new open source have I created as examples for how to do DevOps in this cloud native environment. So that's what this is mostly about. And you should jump on that at bret.news. And it's free. Maybe, and we're planning on moving this at some point to Substack. So it's actually currently hosted on my website, but we're thinking of moving to Substack because that seems to be where all the action's at with newsletters lately. And then let's see, what else we got? In case you didn't know, right above me, Discord server. The Discord server now, I haven't checked recently. We're probably getting near 20,000 people. Pretty exciting. That's a large group of people, but we got lots going on there. And yeah, you should come and hang out. Cloud native DevOps is what we're all about. Containers, running things in distributed environments, Kubernetes, Docker, all things cloud native. All right. And yeah, that's what it's about. So courses, real quick. In case you didn't know, every month I put my Udemy courses on sale. I'm actively in the middle of adding new lectures and updating some things right now. Actually, I spent the last 3 days working on that. So that's my focus recently. But every month I put in new coupons for those courses. And then if you scroll down, there's actually a course on GitHub and Argo CD. Now, this currently is a live-only course, and the next cohort is not scheduled. We're not sure when we're going to do that. The last one we had was last year. We're considering a few things. One is maybe turning this into a traditional video course instead of waiting for me to schedule another live one. So what you should do is, if you're interested in this content, is click on that, sign up with your email, just jump into there, add your email to the list. You get no spam from this list. You will basically only be notified when I release this content in some form, whether it's another cohort that you can join, or if it's maybe a Udemy course or a course I host myself. We don't really have the plan yet down. We're currently focused on updating existing courses, and then we're going to release this content. But a lot of this stuff is actually free on GitHub, so we can talk about that today. And we will, because, Anton asked about it. So we're going to jump into that. The last little piece of news, really real quick, is, in case you didn't know, last week Kubernetes had its 10th birthday. And I will give you a link. So the link is for, I didn't actually know they were going to do this. They live streamed the birthday party from, I think it was in San Francisco. I think that's where they had it. I didn't go. I was actually busy coming back from a family trip in Missouri, and then I was planning on going to Portugal for the Docker Captain Summit, and so I missed the birthday party. But they streamed it. It's a pretty long stream. It's like 3.5 hours or something. But Kelsey Hightower MCs it. He's great. He tells some stories. They have people on to tell stories about what the last 10 years has been like, things like the first commit and growing of the community, and how the CNCF got started, how the Kubernetes project got started. So it's, in case you don't know the history and you weren't around 10 years ago, it's actually a pretty great recap of the last 10 years. And as you can see, I've only gotten about a third of the way through it. But check that out. I've actually been just putting it on in the background while I was working. It's a pretty great little recap of the last few years. All right. Let's see if we got some questions. Hello, everyone. So Anton's wanting me to talk about Argo CD. We will definitely do that. The more specific your questions, the better. And if you have specific questions or issues, or if you're implementing now, the more detailed questions you give me, the better I can give you answers. When is my next tutorial releasing on Udemy? So that's a great question. I think I kind of just said that. Right now I'm in the middle of updating Docker Mastery, adding some more advanced content as well as replacing some out-of-date videos that are a little broken. It's amazing how many of those videos, though, are still good 7 or 8 years later. I started making that course in 2016. And so some of those videos are about 8 years old. And they still hold up today because Docker is very, very backwards compatible. So why replace an old video if it's exactly the same thing? So I'm going through that. I didn't even notice that. Nirmal's mom, Florentina, what's up? I didn't recognize that. I didn't pay attention to the last name. Well, welcome to the show. Sorry Nirmal's not here this week. All right, Raghu. What kind of issues will happen with SSL certificate expiry and how DevOps teams will handle this in the real time? What do you suggest to avoid this issue? So most of us have moved on to Let's Encrypt. You've probably heard about that. Let's Encrypt is the free service that a significant portion of the internet now uses. It's a tried and true method. It's probably been around close to 10 years, completely free. And there's now lots of ways you can use it. In fact, a lot of proxy servers and certificate managers all support it out of the box now. So that's what I would use, absolutely. And in fact, if you can't use it because maybe your company is currently buying certificates, then I would really work hard on moving your company to Let's Encrypt. The only time that I think you can't use Let's Encrypt is if your scenario is your servers are completely offline and could never have access to the internet, and they're just completely cut off from the internet. That's really the only case I can think of with maybe Let's Encrypt not working. I mean, obviously, in that case, you would have to update your certificates. And in that case, you're probably using a private certificate stack where you have a root and you're issuing your own certificates. And then you would use in Kubernetes Certificate Manager. If you're not using, even if you are using Let's Encrypt, you should probably look at Certificate Manager. If you're using proxies like Traffic, which I'm a huge fan of Traffic, it will go get certificates for you automatically. Free from Let's Encrypt every time it needs a new one. If you need to do them manually, then you probably, in Kubernetes at least, you'll probably need to use Certificate Manager, which is the most popular way to manage and store certificates. It's an open source project, and that's built into a lot of distributions of Kubernetes. With Docker, you have nothing built in, so you would either have to do something like Traffic, which is the front-end proxy in front of all your containers that have web servers, and then you'd have a proxy in front of that. That's typically how you would run any Docker container orchestration system or server, because chances are you probably have more than one website. And so instead of getting multiple IPs, you would just get a proxy server like Traffic, Traefik, Traffic. And that's my favorite. There's lots of other ones out there. There's Envoy, Contour, there's Nginx. There's lots of ways you can do it, but I like to. I don't want to do manual certificate stuff, and in fact, I haven't done manual certificates in at least half a decade. So with any of my clients or anyone I'm working with or my own stuff, it's always Let's Encrypt. Zolt's here. What's up? Anton saying, we are building images inside a GitLab CI pipeline on each new release. Okay, good. Is there any way to tell Argo to automatically update each deployment when new images after new specific tags arrive in registry? Yes. That is a plugin to Argo known as the Image Updater. And it's a separate project, but it's made for Argo, and it will watch your image registry of choice. And it will, based on your rules, it looks for a specific tag, essentially using regex. Maybe you have anything for production would have a tag of release, or, I wouldn't use the word prod because that's an environment. But if you have a specific, maybe it's a semver that you use in the tag or something like that, and then it would look for those tags. Or you can just say, whatever image I push to this registry in this particular repository, just ship the newest one. Maybe you have a specific repository just for things ready to release to production, And so it'll just look for the latest image. And you can set it to poll. Yeah, so image updater. Go check that project out. It's in the Argo CD docs, and it's officially part of the Argo CD project. It's just a separate option that's not built in by default yet. That's how I would do it. That's how I have done it with companies that want to use images. I personally prefer the traditional GitOps way of updating GitHub, and I can actually do that automated. And in my course that I just previously mentioned, we teach a way where you can have a GitHub action that watches for certain commits on your main branch of your application repo, and then will automatically create a pull request on your YAML for Kubernetes. And then all you have to do is approve, basically one button, approve that pull request, and then your YAML will be updated. Argo will see the YAML changes in GitHub or GitLab, and then we'll go and re-push those things to kube control apply, essentially. It'll push it to the Kubernetes API. If you aren't a fan of that traditional GitOps method and you want to use a image registry only, then that's when you would use the image updater plugin for Argo CD. So hopefully that helps. All right, let's see what else we got here. Dan's working on his Argo CD, so he's probably very interested in this conversation. Rashik's asking, what do you think as a career in DevOps? I just graduated from university and will be joining a company soon, and my team will mainly work on DevOps side. I have been doing exclusively DevOps for 15 years. So I was doing it before it was called DevOps. We were doing the same thing. Traditionally, we just called it Ops. And when you were Ops in a data center, I was running those teams, but my mindset was I'm always here to help the developer. I want to work closely with the developer and the DBAs. So I would be the one as the team leader, always being a part of other teams and making sure that we were optimized to get them to deploy their code as fast as possible, as frequently as possible. Of course, we didn't have all these wonderful tools back then. But yeah, it's a great career. I love it. I mean, I'll probably be doing this forever. And I highly recommend it. There are lots of people getting into this. The challenge is there are lots of jobs. There's lots of job roles within the world of DevOps. So you can't just say, I have a DevOps job, because that could mean lots of things. That can mean that you're really more ops and that you're really managing server uptime and monitoring. Or maybe you're a Kubernetes cluster administrator, and that's really all you do is just admin the cluster. These all tend to fall under DevOps engineer titles, but they're quite different jobs. And really what we should be using is the DevOps word shouldn't even be in the title of our jobs. It should just be, it's kind of like saying I'm an agile engineer. That's not a job title anyone uses. It's just a way you do things. And to me, DevOps is just a mindset and a process to help deploy code faster, more reliably, with less downtime. And, you know, I think of that as a role. So if you're an SRE, you're traditionally kind of involved a little bit in DevOps. If you're a build engineer, where you're focused on the systems that automatically build the software, that's often labeled DevOps as well. But someone who's doing build engineering is quite different than someone who's doing Kubernetes operations in production. So yeah, it just depends on what you're doing. But yeah, those are all great things. Good job. Congrats. Welcome to the club. Yes, Dan, JQ is awesome. I use JQ all the time. Kustomize is great. Kustomize is my favorite way to deploy Kubernetes in YAML. I prefer that over just standard manifest, and I prefer that over Helm charts. The real reason is because often Helm charts are more complicated than you need them to be. It's more work than you need it to be. And so the reason I decide Kustomize over Helm, and the way that I know which one to use, is I only use Helm if I'm making software and releasing it to others for them to deploy and they don't know the app very well. If that's true, maybe I'm making open source and I'm releasing it on the internet, or maybe I'm in a large company and my team is creating custom software and we're going to give it to other teams to deploy on Kubernetes. In that case, I may make a Helm chart because it'll be easier for them to consume it and deploy it without having to know everything about the app. With Kustomize, I assume that my team is making the software, we control it, and we know the different environments it needs to go to. So Kubernetes, Kubernetes at the end of the day, it all is the same YAML. In the back end, when you don't see this happening, Kustomize and Helm are turning this into standard manifests and then shipping it to the API. So Kubernetes itself doesn't, in the API, understand anything but standard manifests. It doesn't know what a Helm chart is. It doesn't even know what Kustomize is. Kustomize is included in the kube control CLI, but all that's doing is rendering the YAML and then shipping it to the API. So Kubernetes only has one format that it will accept, which is a manifest. And we all can't typically use manifest because that would require you to hard code your stuff, everything. And so you can't usually hard code things like keys or passwords and secrets or environment variables, stuff like that. So Kustomize is great. I use that as examples in my courses a lot, and I only teach Helm or use Helm specifically to teach it. I don't necessarily use Helm in a lot of my projects. But I do use Helm as a consumer. I might need a Postgres database cluster or some fancy operator or maybe Cilium or some other Kubernetes add-on. And in those cases, I will often use Helm because it's just an easier CLI experience. It's easier to consume that. Argo accepts both. So if you're using Argo, it's really up to you. However, whatever way you want to use YAML in Kubernetes, Argo will support that. You're most welcome, Caesar, on the WordPress and Kubernetes. Martin's here. What's up? Yes, that is true. Regulatory requirements may not allow certain certificate providers. I'm not aware. I mean, maybe someone... It would be sad at this point if there were still certain regulatory requirements for public websites to not allow Let's Encrypt. The U.S. government may be an exception there. I don't currently have any U.S. government clients other than for training purposes. So I don't, maybe certain governments maybe require that you use their certificate provider. And in that case, you're just going to have to use Kubernetes Certificate Manager and do it yourself manually unless you have access to some sort of API for renewing that cert. Let's see. Dan's asking, can I use HTTPS termination in traffic to talk to an Apache HTTPD server at port 80? Of course, that's exactly one of the main reasons traffic exists. It is, and the style in Docker and Kubernetes is that you don't want to put certificates in your container apps directly. Those days are gone. One of the biggest reasons for that, besides complexity and having to manage all that inside your app, is that you're usually going to have more than one website running in different containers on a single server or a single cluster. And in the cloud, you don't get multiple IP addresses for your server. So you can't bind mount, Apache website 1 on port 443 and then bind mount Apache server 2 on the same IP address 443. The way to solve that traditionally was you needed like Nginx or something else in front of it, and you had to manually set all that up. But in Kubernetes, we have all these wonderful tools, and both in Docker, Swarm, and Kubernetes, all three of those, traffic supports automated certificate management through Let's Encrypt, or if you want to manually give it certificates, you can, but it's going to be the container that bind mounts to port 80 and 443, and then you give it routes or DNS names or headers or whatever you need to tell it on how to find which container to send the traffic to. And that's like the basics of all the different half dozen or more projects that support, we got Caddy out there. we've got Contour, we've got so much out there for, but Traffic is my favorite. It's the one I first started with back when Docker was young, and it does a lot of things. If I couldn't use Traffic, I might look at Contour, which uses Envoy in Kubernetes. It's pretty advanced. And then if my team required that we use Nginx, that's also another great option. The difference with Nginx is that it doesn't understand all this stuff natively. Nginx doesn't know how to talk to Docker or Kubernetes. So it has wrapper scripts that kind of wrap around the Nginx binary and provide a lot of this automation. It also has a separate controller and other utilities running in a cluster. Test, test, test. Oh, there we're back. Okay. Don't know what's going on there. I have a brand new microphone input. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, hopefully that'll stay good for now. Gosh, it looks a little hot. I'm going to turn that down a little again. All right. Let me know how that audio sounds. I'm going to keep going until that crashes again. That's very wild. I don't understand why that happened. Yay! My microphone has the old style USB mini or micro, and the cable has gotten really loose recently, and I don't know what to do about it because it's not the cable, it's actually the mic. So I might have to just buy a new microphone. All right. Try giving the microphone has lost its voice. Okay. Let's get back to the... Oh, EU government only allows EU CAs. Yeah. I mean, that's a very specific scenario. So, and I'm certainly not an expert on that stuff. So I'd like to think that those providers provide an API so that you could renew digitally instead of a human, manually creating a certificate, downloading it manually and uploading it manually, storing it like a file. Like, hopefully those days are gone for most of us. All right, Jerome's back, or with a new question. I'm a sysadmin, but I'd like to get further into administer Kubernetes clusters. I finished your K8's Mastery Udemy with micro K8s. Do you have any recommendations on courses that focus on AWS EKS? No, I don't. I'm sure that other courses have a module on EKS, but there are, what I would use is personally, there's EKS documentation. They have their own dedicated website. I'm trying to remember the name of it. You probably know about that. Tons of documentation on it, and I would use that first, and then I'd probably use YouTube myself if I had any questions. Granted, EKS is still standard Kubernetes, but it adds on some operators. You'll be able to use AWS load balancers with certain operators and controllers inside of that Kubernetes cluster, as well as their own storage features if you need to use EFS or something like that. You can use those all inside of EKS. It obviously follows the permissions model of AWS and some of the other things. So it's gotten way better. EKS over the years has been difficult to manage. There's lots of complexity. I would say it's probably of all the major cloud providers, it's probably the most complex one to manage, but they have gotten easier. So updating it is one of the biggest pains, but you can now do that through the web GUI, or you can control it through the CLI. You don't have to manually update it as much anymore. There's easier ways to do it, as well as getting add-ons. You can go through their store. I know that's probably not the right word, but you can put plugins in and then auto-manage those through their AWS interface as well. So, yeah, I don't have a course on that yet. I'm trying to not get into the Azure, Kubernetes version, because there's just so many different variants of distributions. So I don't have any plan for that. One of the challenges too is just adding a module of it into any course assumes people have pretty deep knowledge of AWS, which then becomes a problem because a lot of people that take my courses don't. They're new to a lot of the stuff. They're new to cloud. They're new to Docker. So I would have to sort of teach them, policies, network policies, and security, and IAMs, and just it would be so much work. I just wouldn't want to do it. So I try to avoid it, which is kind of why in the courses I tend to demo on DigitalOcean or something, because to me, cloud courses are separate from infrastructure. So how does Splunk? Oh, I think I missed a question. John, let's see. Which DevOps use cases does Golang have? I think you mean Golang, not Golang. Any advice on how to become ready? Golang is just another programming language. Nothing inherently specific about DevOps for it, but it is attractive to those of us more on the ops side who are developers, because like Rust and C, and now increasingly more languages, it has a compiler built in that can create a static binary. So when you want utilities and tools in your build systems or in your automation systems, those tools are easier to manage if you build a single binary and then it runs on any Linux server. So Golang is relatively easy to learn, and there's a ton in the standard library, which is basically a ton of functionality and features with the Golang itself. You don't have to go like maybe some other languages. If I was in Node.js, for example, to build a standard a basic command line tool, or a basic web server, or to even communicate with web servers, I might need a half a dozen or more modules inside of my Node.js app. And then I'd have hundreds, if not probably thousands of files, including all those dependencies that I'd have to move around to run it. With Go, you can use the standard library for a ton of stuff. And I mean, it's great. There's so much in there that you can use out of the box. So often I will need very little, if any, third-party modules or dependencies in order to build a single file that I can move around freely. I can put it in a container, and it's just one file in my container, and I can run that from anywhere. So Go tends to be one of the favorite tools of choice. Also, the DevOps community has really adopted containers, and a majority of the container tooling out there is built with Go. Docker, built with Go. Kubernetes, built with Go. Traffic, built with Go. And if you go down the list, no pun intended, a majority of the cloud native tooling out there and the container tooling is built with Go. So if you're someone who lives in open source and you want to help those projects, maybe you want to patch them using that language, it teaches you that language, and then you think, well, I want to use this language for my own tooling. So I tend to use two things in DevOps nowadays. Python we used to use. Python is still great for machine learning, scientific efforts. It's still the leading language there, mostly not because the language is better, it's just because there's so many great libraries for visualizations and math, and just tons of stuff there in the scientific community. For networking, network computing, and systems computing, Go has a lot built in, so it tends to be the one that we go to now. So my two languages that I typically use in DevOps the most, again, you don't even have to be a programmer to be in DevOps. It just depends on your role, what exactly you're doing. But if I can do it simply in a shell, I will just make a shell script, a bash script. If I can't, if it's going to be unusually complex, or if I maybe want to create a really nice little CLI that I can run from any Linux machine or any Mac machine, or even Windows, right? You can build a Windows binary with Go. I will do that in Go. So, and I think a lot of other people are doing that as well. There's conference talks out there on Go being the preferred language of sysadmins, SREs, DevOps, that kind of thing. Great question. That's a great question. Ragu, sorry if I mispronounced that. How does Splunk tool help operations teams? Do you know any other tools which can be used instead of Splunk? Sure. Splunk is a as far as I'm aware, it's a closed sourced logging, primarily a logging tool back in the days. I have not used it in years, but back when it first got started, it was one of the best log searching and indexing tools for all your apps. So you would have all your apps send their logs to Splunk, and you could use that. But nowadays, a lot of people might use Loki. If you're talking about logging specifically, Loki, Loki, is a great tool for running in Kubernetes world. That's a free open source log management and indexing tool. So it's a centralized system that you would send all of your container logs into it. And you would maybe check that one out. That's probably the number one that I'm aware of, the number one open source tool for those of us using Docker and Kubernetes. Anton's back. One of your previous live streams, you've shown a website with Kubernetes online distro configurator. Could you please show it again? Yes. So that was the quickest. I'm going to have to remember K8. So it's from a company, Replicated, and they have lots of great open source. So if I can't remember the name of it, because they create all these things. So they have COTS, they have Troubleshoot, which is great, curl. Curl is what we're talking about. So curl, oh, sorry, no. Wait, that took me to COTS. That's weird. They also have Unfork, Outdated, Schema Hero, TTL. They have all these great tools, mostly centered around Kubernetes, almost exclusively. I don't know why it's sending me curl.sh. Okay. I'll put this in chat. So curl is, instead of like curl with a C, like you would hit a website, curl with a K. And this is nice because you can go through and build your own distribution, and you can say, I want this specific version of Kubernetes. I want to use Containerd, or it used to have options like Containerd and Docker. And then they used to have lots of options. Wow, they've really removed a lot of the options nowadays. You used to be able to use Containerd or Docker. You used to be able to use Flannel or other versions of networking. You used to be able to use Contour or other ingress options. This is your cluster administrator tool you choose. If you want a log, basically a log tool that will maybe pick up your log files, you don't necessarily need FluentD if your applications are container native and they know how to get their stuff into Kubernetes. But if you have a remote system and you need to have your logs filtered so that it only includes certain log messages and stuff like that, you would want FluentD. COTS is a separate tool that you probably don't need unless you're already aware that you need to use COTS. It allows you to ship commercial off-the-shelf software, or COTS with a C. It allows you to ship that stuff on top of Kubernetes. You have object store, PVC storage, monitoring and metrics, cert manager, like we talked about earlier. If you want a Docker registry, I don't know why they use Docker registry here. I would Harbor is my preferred registry. If I'm going to run my own registry, I'm going to run Harbor because it uses Docker registry underneath, but it's more full featured. And then if you need backups, you can use Valero. So you can check all the things you want, and then you'll see this little, you can even store and manage the versions on the right over here with your own YAML. You can store this YAML in a Git repository and manage your cluster's versions this way. I know a few companies that actually use this in production. And then you can even one line, like if you set it all up the way you want it, you can just use this line to install Kubernetes on a Linux server automatically. So check that out. I had Replicated on the show. If you go back in this show a year or two ago, maybe, I had their CEO on the show, and we walked through a lot of their open source tools and what Replicated does. Great question. Zolt's like, hey, can you review my PR, bro? Would you review my PR on your PodSpec repo and talk about capabilities, AppArmor, SE Linux, and stuff like that? Let's go to the PodSpec. Let's talk about PodSpec for a second. So I have a PodSpec example, or pod specification, PodSpec for short. So everybody needs their own PodSpec standard that they follow. And I've provided you with what I think is the best way to start. Everything you do on Kubernetes is a pod. Whether you got deployments or any other resource type, if you want to run a container in Kubernetes, you need a PodSpec. You have to have it. And so there are other things like replica sets and then deployments. And they all rely on stateful sets, init containers, daemon sets. Like there's just a ton of things, but at the core, they all need a PodSpec. Can't get away from it. So what I use, I basically did this for myself and then for my clients. And I started giving this to people, and then I started making comments in it. And I thought, hey, I should just give this away. It's a really good resource for starting out. So if I'm going to start a new project with any company or on my own for Kubernetes, building an app to run on Kubernetes, I'm going to use this PodSpec to start. I may not use every single one of these things, but this is a list of the things you need to be considering when you deploy it. So we can actually go through it as an individual file here. Now, one of the main benefits of this is enabling a lot of security options that aren't there by default. Kubernetes is an unopinionated orchestrator. For example, Docker Swarm is not unopinionated. It is definitely opinionated. Swarm has one, maybe two ways to do things, and that's it. It's simple, it's opinionated, which is great until you need something that it doesn't do. And so that's what Kubernetes is. It doesn't have an opinion. It has 1,000 ways you can deploy or manage YAML or do things. It has 3 different ways you can make the YAML. Like it just has all these different ways. And so it comes sort of generic. And it's up to you to decide how you want to use it, which means, unfortunately, a lot of the base security features are turned off by default. A lot of the monitoring and probes are turned off by default. Resource limits turned off by default. But these are all things that we should all be using. And most teams that deploy to production eventually figure this out. I provide this to you for free. So in here, one of the things is I enable setcomp. We can talk about that. But there's other things in here that I don't even have, which are pretty advanced and require extra steps and work on your part. So if you're going to do them, you're already going to probably know about them. Those 2 things specifically are SE Linux or AppArmor. SE Linux, AppArmor, and capabilities, or we sometimes call them Linux capabilities or kernel capabilities, those 3 things, and even setcomp here, all 4 overlap. There are areas where one is maybe better than the other, and I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on that. But when Docker was created, going back over a decade ago, Jessie Frizzell, those of you that are in container land may know of her, she went out, and what they did with Docker was they profiled like a few hundred popular open source apps and profiled them on the kernel to see what they needed from the kernel. What system calls would they be using in the kernel? And then what they did was they created a setcomp profile that's the default in every Docker container you ever run with a Docker command. Setcomp is turned on by default in Docker. And what it does is it's a simple little file that just becomes installed with Docker, and it locks down any container you run in Docker to limit the system calls in Linux that it can use. This is kind of related, but not related in most ways to which permissions you have on the file system or which user you're running as or which namespace you're in or which C group limits you're using. This is all, I think there's hundreds and hundreds of Linux syscalls, and so they cut, I don't know what it is, like they cut down, they cut out 60% of the system calls because you just don't need them in most open source. Turns out Kubernetes by default turns off seccomp. It also has everything else turned off. It turns off limiting system capabilities. It turns off AppArmor. It turns off SE Linux. It doesn't so much turn them off. It just doesn't apply special profiles. But seccomp comes with Docker out of the box with a default profile. But Kubernetes, in order to be standard and to be unopinionated, turns it off. These two lines basically say, turn seccomp back on for this pod and any containers running in it, and then apply the runtime's defaults. What is your runtime default? Well, there's three main runtimes. There's Docker, Containerd, and Cryo. Now, Containerd by far is the most popular. And it turns out because Containerd was created by the Docker team, that it has that same default profile that ships with Containerd. So if you enable this on line 52, then it will ensure that you have narrowed down the capabilities that your application can even try to use in Linux, hence tighter security. Now, you'll know pretty quick if your app doesn't work with this, and I've never run into an app that doesn't work with this, but I mostly use open source apps. But if you do, you just can take the profile file, you can just do a quick research, the Docker docs, everything else on the internet, it clearly explains all this. It's all in open source. It's actually in these repos for Docker and Kubernetes and Containerd. They have these default profiles for seccomp, and you can just copy it, modify it to change what you need, and you'll usually get very specific errors. You might have to get into profiling tools or whatever, but eventually you'll add or remove the things you need for your app, but I've never done it. I've never needed to do that. You might, if you have a very custom specialized app. Now, AppArmor and SE Linux, AppArmor tends to be in the Debian and Ubuntu communities, and SE Linux is more in the Red Hat, CentOS communities. But those two are competing formats that are a little more friendly, in my understanding, than seccomp. They tend to overlap a lot. You can totally run both of these at the same time. You would not run, by the way, SE Linux and AppArmor at the same time. That decision is typically made by which distribution you're running on your host. If you're running Ubuntu, then you're going to use AppArmor. And that's what it's like to lose your voice on air. Oh, my goodness. So I have a cold this week. So I'm going to have to go. But thanks for being here. I'll see you next week when I have my voice back. Ciao, everybody.